Hey everybody, there have been some rumors recently about Hoyo assembling a full male team, so I wanted to talk about some of my thoughts on the rumors, some clues that point towards these rumors being very possible, as well as some of my thoughts on the concept of Hoyo gender-locking teams to begin with. First off, in case you haven't seen the rumors, the full male team is supposedly going to be the team where Ashvale finally fits in. At the moment, Ashvale is a follow-up attack sub-DPS with no team that can make full use of his sub-DPS capabilities because he's better off as a main DPS right now. So it's obvious to everyone that Ashvale is eventually going to get a team built around him where he's supposed to fit in. Well, according to leakers, this team is going to be Ashvale, the new Blade, and the new Aventurine. We already know we're getting a new version of Blade, with his design officially revealed and everything, and even if we didn't already have his design revealed by Hoyo, it would have already been a pretty safe assumption given Blade's prominence in Planarcadia's story as one of the current active Stellaron hunters alongside Silverwolf. Aventurine is a bit more of a dark horse. We've been getting leaks about a new version of Aventurine for a while now, but Hoyo hasn't really dropped many hints about him. This is most likely because Aventurine is rumored to release after Planarcadia's story has already wrapped up. If we operate under this assumption, then suddenly we actually do have some hints we can pick up about the new Aventurine. Hoyo has already revealed in the patch 4.0 trailer that Planarcadia will only last for half of version 4, unlike Amphorius, which took up the entirety of version 3. And Hoyo even revealed the planet we'd be going to after Planarcadia, the IPC's resort Astropolis. And when they were teasing Astropolis as our next stop, they even went as far as to show Aventurine for a brief second. If you combine these hints with the sheer amount of leakers who have been talking about Aventurine 2.0, I think it's pretty safe to say that Aventurine is for sure getting a new version, just like Silverwolf and Blade are. I'm not going to say it's confirmed, of course, but it seems pretty likely. Just like we knew Danhung and March were getting new versions very early on into Amphorius' story, thanks to leaks. So that's the first thing I wanted to get out of the way. All of the evidence makes these leaks about Aventurine seem very likely to happen. But just because Aventurine is likely going to get a new playable version doesn't necessarily confirm the full male team, right? Not necessarily. However, there's a lot about the leaks that makes a lot of sense. First off, Aventurine's current playable version is tailor-made for follow-up attack teams. In fact, every IPC Stoneheart so far is a follow-up attack character to some degree. So if Ashvale is going to get a new follow-up attack DPS tailor-made for him, it just makes sense with the IPC's track record for this new follow-up attack DPS to be Aventurine. Of course, Pearl is also an IPC Stoneheart who happens to have a specific dynamic with Ashvale in the story. So wouldn't it make sense for Pearl to be Ashvale's follow-up attack DPS as well? We'll get to that in a second. First, let's discuss the leaked roles each of the characters are apparently going to be playing on the team. Ashvale is, of course, a sub-DPS, and Aventurine has been leaked to be the main DPS of the team. Furthermore, he's been leaked to be an Elation character who doesn't make use of other Elation teammates, thus making him stand out from the general design of the Elation path, sort of like Aglaya with the Remembrance path, even though the release of Cyrene made Aglaya lean a bit harder into running Remembrance teammates, but that's besides the point. The leaks of Elation Aventurine make even more sense when you consider the fact that Aventurine mentions in the Penacony story that he was originally invited by the Masked Fools to be a follower of Elation, and that was one potential path he could have gone down if he had chosen not to join the IPC. Aventurine's character in the lore is literally split between Preservation and Elation, so it would make a ton of sense for those to be the two paths of his two different versions. But how is a Hunt character like Ashvale supposed to synergize with an Elation character like Aventurine? Excellent question. Look no further than Evanesia's early beta. Evanesia was originally an Elation character who was not nearly as reliant on other Elation characters as the other characters in her path. Of course, this changed throughout her beta, but it proves that Hoyo is perfectly capable of designing Elation characters who use the mechanics of the Elation path, in Evanesia's case, Certified Banger, but they use the mechanic in a way that does not tie them down to the mono Elation shilling that the Elation path seemingly inherently incentivizes. It isn't too hard to imagine them doing a similar thing with Aventurine. For instance, since a solo Elation character would cause the AHA instant to be very slow, perhaps Aventurine has other ways of action advancing the AHA instant, such as advancing AHA every time an ally launches a follow-up attack. This would make AHA function much less like an Elation mechanic, and much more like one of the follow-up attack mechanics from Divergent Universe. It would easily incentivize him to pair up with a character like Ashvale, instead of pairing up with other Elation characters like Yao Guang. There's even further evidence that Ashvale was designed around a character like Aventurine when you look at how Hoyo changed Ashvale's kit during his V3. While Ashvale's numbers got rebalanced in favor of changing his ultimate rotation, and his damage overall didn't get nerfed too hard, the one big thing that changed about Ashvale was his team-wide damage percent buff. It seemed crazy to me that Hoyo would just take Ashvale's team-wide 80% damage buff and press the delete button on it, instead making it only apply to Ashvale himself. But now, with these leaks about Aventurine being his tailor-made main DPS, it actually makes a ton of sense. Why is that? Because, remember, Elation damage does not utilize damage percent. It's why you never run a damage percent orb on any Elation character besides Evanescia, who once again stands apart from her other Elation characters. If Aventurine is a follow-up attack character whose damage counts as Elation damage, then Ashvale's 80% follow-up attack damage bonus would not affect Aventurine's Elation damage. It would just be a useless aspect of Ashvale's kit for Aventurine. Meanwhile, the buffs that Ashvale does provide, 40% defense spread and 120% crit damage, are all very huge for a theoretical Elation follow-up attack character like Aventurine. Additionally, just so we're clear, we already have the precedent set for follow-up attacks that deal Elation damage, since Evanescia's Master Fox was recently changed to count as an Elation follow-up attack. Obviously, Evanescia's Master Fox isn't a large enough portion of her damage to want to build a team around it, but if Aventurine's entire kit is comprised of stuff similar to Evanescia's Master Fox, dealing Elation damage through follow-up attacks, then it would perfectly synergize with Ashvale and explain why Ashvale lost the damage percent buffs in his kit. But wait, there's more. One last piece of evidence pointing to this future team-up between the follow-up attack sub-DPS Ashvale and his Elation main DPS Aventurine. Oftentimes, Divergent Universe will foreshadow the kits or synergies of future characters through the new curios that they add in. Don't get me wrong, sometimes they add in some nonsensical curios, such as the Fire DOT curio that no character wanted, but there have been curios in the past that foreshadowed future synergies and character kits, such as those curios that hinted at the synergy between a Wind and Quantum character, as well as a Hunt and Nihility character, hinting at Cypher being a teammate for Fei Xiao before we even had Cypher leaks. Well, the newest update to Divergent Universe has brought with it a very curious new curio that states, Elation Path characters' Elation damage is now considered follow-up attack damage, and their follow-up attack crit damage increases by 150%. How very interesting that Hoyo is already setting up for some sort of connection between Elation damage and follow-up attack damage, as if setting up for some future character. It just lends even more credence to the rumors of a full male team with Aventurine and Ashvale. Also, this maybe matters a bit less, but Elation used to be the follow-up attack path in Divergent Universe, so it sort of just makes sense for the two of them to have a connection, you know? Now, whether this has convinced you about Aventurine or not, let's finally talk about the third piece of this puzzle, Blade. Honestly, there's a lot less solid evidence of any of the rumors involving Blade. The only thing really working in Blade's favor here is the fact that there are so many hints suggesting that the Ashvale plus Aventurine rumors are true, which therefore means that the leakers who are suggesting Blade is also part of this team also deserve a bit of credibility. But other than that, I really don't have any of the solid evidence for Blade's role in this team, the same way I had with Ashvale and Aventurine. So instead of trying to provide evidence, I'll just talk about what we know so far from rumors. Blade is supposedly some sort of support and DPS mix, which is sort of weird since that's also what Ashvale does. So Ashvale and Blade are playing very similar roles, while Aventurine takes on the primary DPS role. If we were to compare it to the Mono Remembrance team, I suppose you can think of it as Ashvale being the Evernight, Blade being the Cyrene, and Aventurine being the Casteress. It's a team made up of a bunch of damage dealers who also simultaneously support each other, which is what follow-up attack teams always should have been, in my opinion. The follow-up attack archetype in general just lends itself really well to having characters playing off of each other. So I think the prospect of Ashvale and Blade both being sub DPSs rather than full-on supports is really exciting. And the idea of their follow-up attacks somehow being used to support Aventurine's Elation mechanics instead of Aventurine wanting other Elation characters is also really exciting. There are a lot of interesting and fun directions Hoyo could take with the design of this team's gameplay. However, this team is clearly lacking something, and that is a sustain. Ashvale obviously isn't a sustain, and I think it makes sense for Hoyo to make Aventurine fill out a different role than his original version. So everything we've theorized in regards to Aventurine being the main DPS makes even more sense if you take that into account. And if we believe the leaks about Blade being a support DPS, because the leaks also seem to have a lot of evidence in regards to Aventurine, then that leaves the sustain role missing. And here's where we circle back around to Pearl. Yes, I know, all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, this is no longer an actual full male team. But listen, this is the best Hoyo can do for us. I'm sure other sustains can substitute the sustain role just fine if all you need is to stay alive. The original Aventurine or Danheng PT should be perfectly fine since they're both follow-up attack sustains. However, as we stated earlier, every IPC Stoneheart thus far has had some synergy with follow-up attacks to some degree, which means, presumably, Pearl would also follow in this pattern. However, there isn't any role left on this team for Pearl to fill out aside from the sustain role. So is Pearl going to be another follow-up attack DPS or support of some kind, even though the full new follow-up attack team seems to already be occupied? I would personally have trouble seeing this happening, which is why I see Pearl being a follow-up attack sustain of some sort, rounding out the new follow-up attack team. But this part about Pearl is pure speculation. I just wanted to throw it in there to suggest that the team might not be literally full male, but it's probably still the closest thing we've gotten to a full male team actively being pushed as each other's teammates in Honkai Star Rail. But why does this even matter? Well, technically it doesn't matter, but I do think it is notable because Hoyo Hoyo tends to push the exact opposite, aka Hoyo tends to push full female teams instead of full male teams, especially recently. The most notable examples have been the Mono Elation team coming up, or the Mono Remembrance team before that, wherein the Remembrance path is literally all female, save for the Trailblazer, or the Firefly Break team, or of course the DOT team. So while I don't think it actually matters that Hoyo pushes different types of gender-locked teams, I just think it's worth noting when Hoyo does something different. Additionally, I think it probably does matter to a lot of players who specifically want to pull for the types of characters they're attracted to. The aforementioned teams of Remembrance, Break, and DOT are all very easy teams to invest into for people who only want to pull for women, but there hasn't really been an equivalent for husbando players, which is why the prospect of Hoyo crafting and pushing this full male team is notable. Of course, this type of team-specific gender locking probably isn't too important for a decent amount of people, especially meta-focused people. But the reason Hoyo does this is to sell characters in a package to people who are more incentivized to enjoy every character in that package. If you want to understand better why Hoyo would do gender-locked team packages like this, look no further than Acheron and Jiaoqiu way back during Jiaoqiu's first release. Jiaoqiu was undeniably Acheron's best in slot back in the day, but many Acheron mains still refused to pull for him. Or look at Finon and Saridra. As your resident Finon guy, I know way too many Finon mains who refused to pull for Saridra because Jiaoqiu and Saridra don't market to the same type of players who would main Acheron and Finon. By releasing team packages that market to the same type of fan, in this case, waifu players versus husbando players, Hoyo avoids the Jiaoqiu or Saridra problem of best in slot supports being avoided even by fans of their tailor-made DPS. Granted, I think there are pros and cons to both ways of Hoyo's methods, for Hoyo specifically, not necessarily for the player. The reason Hoyo sometimes sells supports like Jiaoqiu or Saridra to players who wouldn't normally pull for those characters is to drive up those characters' sales, forcing players to pull characters they wouldn't normally pull for. The gender locking of team packages admittedly tends to be more player-friendly in terms of having a higher chance of making a full best-in-slot team all appeal to the same type of player base. So that's another reason why I actually do think it would be a good sign for Hoyo to do something like this. Again, they've done it a lot with female characters all being in each other's teams, and they've done it to a lesser degree with Sunday mainly seeing use nowadays as a second or third best-in-slot option for the male Crisis heirs if you don't have Cyrene available for them, so there is some precedence for this, and it's definitely something to keep your eyes out for. Granted, please do not pull Ashvale right now solely based on these possible rumors. Only pull Ashvale if you actively want to play him as a hypercarry right now, okay? There is no guarantee that any of this ends up being real, and even if this is Hoyo's current intention with Ashvale's team, there is no guarantee Hoyo manages to stick the landing. It could easily end up being a Herta and Naxa situation where Hoyo screws up the design of the characters' synergy together. So please just wait for more information if you only want Ashvale for the possibility of his role in this full male team. Aventurine is supposedly releasing sometime around patch 4.5, so that'll be plenty of time for an Ashvale rerun. I don't want anybody making any hasty decisions based on this information. Hasty pulling decisions aside, this news is fairly exciting and has probably become one of the things I'm looking forward to the most in HSR's near future. Let me know if you're excited for it as well. Share any thoughts you have in the comments below, especially regarding some of the ideas I laid out about Aventurine's possible role in synergizing with Ashvale, as well as my evidence. Am I just reaching? I'm not sure I'm just reaching when leakers have been backing up the claims, but maybe it's cope since I would love to invest all in on Aventurine. We can all cope together. I'll definitely be continuing to keep a close eye on any updates about this team, so consider subscribing to the channel to not miss out on that. And like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. Elation is all fun and games, but for me, version 4 is going to be the version of follow-up attacks. But that's all from me on this topic. Thank you so much for watching, and with all of that said, until next time!